Good morning, Andrea. How are you doing this morning?
I'm great, Simon. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks. I'm good. I'm good. Happy Friday to you.
Indeed.
Nice sunny day today. So, have you had a good week? Good productive
Yeah,
week?
busy but good. We're coming up on our financial year close on January 31st, so always a busy time, but never too busy to speak with you about my favorite topics.
Oh, oh, so charming. Thank you very much. Yeah. Okay. Well, look, obviously, it's great. Very excited to have you on the show with us today and talk about, the sort of sprawling topic of sales enablement. I know that you're currently running the global program and teams for sales enablement. So, thanks again for taking the time.
A pleasure.
So, look, for people that haven't sort of tuned into the show before, what we're trying to do over here at Thornton Gregory is kind of create a bit of community and obviously unpack some of these amazing topics around our space. We're inviting kind of thought leaders that I've built relationships with over the last 10 years to talk about different topics, including go-to-market leadership, including customer success professional services, and obviously the role that plays in the current market. Building world-class sales engines and outbound engines, which we've covered a couple of interesting topics, which we think are really good in this current market, art pre-sales solutions consulting, and also RevOps and sales enablement. We've had a couple of topics and guests that we've covered on this before. I think it's a really, really cool and dynamic space that companies are leveraging, some well, some not so well. I think over the hundreds of people I've spoken about in this space, I hope you don't mind me saying, but Andrew, I think, probably one of the strongest profiles and, got such amazing knowledge across companies like LinkedIn, Mixpanel, Showpad, and then obviously most recently you're, leading the function for Content Square. So, hopefully we can unpack some of this cool stuff today. I guess before the meeting and having a little bit of a chit chat with you, we tried to kind of unpack a little bit around sort of your personal background. I believe you're a very keen traveller. You mentioned as well you've just gone to Florence of all places. That's cool. Did
Thanks.
you have a
Yeah,
nice trip?
it was lovely. Thanks. One of my favorite cities.
Yeah, and is it right to say is it over 60 countries that you've travelled to? Is that
Yeah,
right?
I want to say 65. Um, I haven't counted in a while, but yeah, it's one of my lifelong passions, and I'm lucky enough to live abroad and have the opportunity to do that.
Yeah, amazing. Okay, cool. And then also you mentioned as well about doing some stand up maybe in New York. What was that like as an experience?
Yeah, wow, that is going deep into the archives. My only saving grace, Simon, is that it was before the age of social media. Just to give you a sense of how long ago that was. Actually, I think it was before the age of mobile phones, even. So there's, I
Okay.
think, one VHS tape as evidence. But yeah, in my early 20s, it was a bit of a whim doing the club scene in New York. And look, I've worked now for the over 20 years on three continents with blue chips, with startups. I've worked for companies that have IPO'd, been acquired, shut down. Um, I've been through recessions, COVID, 9/11, and I will say, doing stand up comedy is still the scariest thing I've ever had to do. If you could
I
do that,
bet.
you could do anything.
Yeah, yeah. That is that's a great test of your character to get up there and put yourself in such an awkward situation. But I'm sure you killed it. So
Ended on the night, but
I'm sure.
you know, I think it teaches you some good lessons on resilience and humility as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay, cool. So, as always with these shows, I try and just piece together a few data points to kind of validate the reason why this is such an important area of our market. And I found some cool kind of data sets just in my my travels around sales enablement. It shared with the actual space is worth around $2.4 billion today. So huge market already, and that industry is predicted to grow to around $11 billion by 2032. So huge growth. It's 358% increase over the next 8 years. Also, sales enablement budgets will increase by 50% within the next 5 years as a way of addressing shifted buyer preference, boost seller effectiveness, and drive revenue growth, according to Gartner, one of their most recent reports, which is quite cool. And also, sales enablement greatly influences sales, with 76% of businesses who implement sales enablement report a rise in revenue of 6 to 20%. So showing that if companies can get this right, they can really see revenue as revenue increasing and increasing by a large amount. And also, just in terms of like the hype around the space, Google have noted that an increase of 51.2% searches around sales enablement or similar over the last year on year. So it's just, there's lots of people looking at the topic, eyes on it. And obviously Andrea's been one of the people that have been in it through its growth, and it's, how she sees it today is really important for the people that may be listening. So hopefully that sets the scene, and maybe we can dig into that with some of the questions today. So look, for the people, we touched upon a few things there, but for the people that don't know you, within a few minutes, can you just give us a little bit about your background, career to date, and what brought you into the sales enablement space, please?
Sure. Well, I'd say, like many people who have been in the space for a while, my entry into sales enablement was very opportunistic. So I was a frontline salesperson, an account director at LinkedIn, and living in London. And I wanted to move to Asia to have that sort of life experience. And as I was scoping out internal opportunities within LinkedIn, this enablement role came up. And one of my mentors at work, who was leading enablement for EMEA, said, I think you should go for it. It could be interesting for you. I think you'd be good at it. So it wasn't until I sort of was presented with a potential opportunity that I really started to dig in and understand, well, what is this job? What does it entail? What would I be doing? What would I be able to leverage? What would be new? So obviously, long story short, I got the job. It enabled me to move my family to Asia, where I had 6 wonderful years as first boots on the ground, but then eventually growing and scaling a team for a $500 million business across Asia Pacific through LinkedIn's acquisition by Microsoft and a number of business transformations. So enablement, we'll talk about this, I'm sure, along the way, but 10, 15 years ago, this wasn't really a known profession, or certainly it wasn't as ubiquitous as it is today. So I think it's just something I happened to discover. But once I discovered it, what I realized is that it played to a lot of my strengths and kind of my earlier background, which included sales, go-to-market, recruitment, arts administration, kind of a varied background. But I think enablement is one of those very varied roles that it pulls on, an analytical part of your brain, certainly program project management, stakeholder management, creativity, delivery. So, the early actress in me still loves getting up in front of a room of people or a virtual room of people and engage and draw them out. And I remember I spent almost a decade working in talent acquisition, and, there's something to helping people get a job and now helping people succeed in the job that's very fulfilling. So since leaving LinkedIn in 2021, I've had the opportunity to work at smaller scale-up businesses, really establishing or in some cases revamping their enablement functions. So it's what's kept me in enablement is the fact that even though I think that the core building blocks of what enablement is remain the same, how to do the job, what the job entails, and how to succeed in it really varies depending on the company. So it's definitely a career path I would never have thought of, but now that I'm in it, has been very stimulating for many years.
No, it's a great story. No, amazing. Yeah. Okay. And when you talk about enablement, how do you define that, and like who is responsible? Is it, like you mentioned there about it's changed a lot, but is it training, coaching, content, process, tools, or is it actually everything and all of those combined?
Yes. It's a great question, and I think this is definitely a hot button topic within the community because enablement is one of these very interesting practitioners where, depending on who you ask, you get a different definition. What is an accountant? You know what that is. What is a teacher? You know what that is. What is an enabler? Well, it's not the easiest thing to explain to someone like at a cocktail party what you do. And if you ever go to an enablement conference or, I'm sure yourself, Simon, meeting a number of enablement professionals, you get very different answers in terms of remit. Even if you look at the thought leadership, if you look at the definitions, say, between Gartner and Forrester, the analysts, right? Or between industry bodies as well as vendors. And even within, companies themselves, if you look at job descriptions, it all has to do with improving rep performance, field performance, ultimately, revenue acceleration. But what constitutes, quote, enablement, it really varies. So to me, it comes down to achieving or solving for three things. Enablement owns or is responsible. So I'm going to take that one over. Enablement drives field performance through the enhancement of knowledge, skills, and behavior. Do I know what to do? Am I good at doing it? And am I doing it? So when it comes to things like training versus content versus tools versus process, to me, those are the sort of toolkit that underpins what knowledge, skills, or behavior are necessary. So from a behavioral perspective, if we want somebody to log their meetings or map their account, for instance, or record, say, meta criteria within their discovery, well, they need a process to do that. They need a structure to do that, and they need a tool to do that. They might need some training to teach them what to do and how to do it, and some content that they can refer back to with either the right questions or the right criteria, right? So I think sometimes enablement gets very pigeonholed in terms of how it's delivered, but I like to think about what is necessary to drive the change we need to see, and then what are the vehicles for enhancing that knowledge, skill, and behavior based on what the goal is for a particular initiative. And then your question, of course, is who is responsible? The answer is everybody, right? It's kind of like asking someone who's responsible for ensuring your child is educated. Is it the school? Yeah. Is it the teachers? Yeah. Is it the parents? Yeah. Is it society? Yeah. Is it the kid themselves? Also, yeah. So when it comes to, sales enablement is no different than any other kind of people development. It's about the manager very heavily. It's about the formal education and, as we just discussed, the sort of underpinnings of that knowledge, skill, and behavior. Are they given that opportunity to learn and improve? Are they being held accountable and being modeled that behavior, right? So this is where enablement and managers combine. Is the company investing in the right ways and setting them up for success? Is there a compelling go-to-market proposition? Does the pricing make sense, right? Just think about all the things that go into a rep's success. Ultimately, a lot of enablement comes down to the individual salesperson. Are they committed to improving? Are they open-minded to improve? You can sit through all the training sessions or watch all the videos you want, but if you're not going to put that into practice, or you're like, what I do now is just fine, thanks, you're falling on deaf ears. So it's a simple question with probably an overly complicated answer, but that is also part of what makes this space so interesting. Perhaps in 10 years, this will all be figured out and it'll be a much more straightforward place to play. But I think for any of us in the profession at the moment, you're sort of on the knife edge of templating and standardizing and professionalizing, what this job is for the next generation, which, if you like to build things, is pretty cool.
Great answer, Andrea. Yeah, that's amazing depth to that, and just like an insight into the complexity of all the moving parts. That's so cool. Okay, and look, that probably leads us quite nicely into, you've been in the space almost since day dot, but with the sort of sales enablement changes, technology and general changes over the last 10 years, how have you seen the role and the business function evolve over that last 10 years?
Yeah, I don't think it's day dot because definitely this existed before I got into it. I'm not that old yet, but since I came into it, about 10 years ago,
Yeah,
I've definitely seen this become a profession. So,
cool.
there went from being a few scattered people, for instance, who did this to, tens of thousands of people with a LinkedIn profile that has some derivative of enablement, sales enablement, revenue enablement, effectiveness, readiness, whatever you'd call it. It's definitely a recognized profession. Yourself, Simon, focusing on talent acquisition for different businesses, perhaps 5 or 10 years ago, you wouldn't have even received an enablement brief. And now, you have multiple and you're placing people. So I think that's been really interesting that it's now become a really recognized and respected profession. I think that we've also seen businesses start to recognize, as you quoted earlier from the analysts and the research, that it's not just a nice to have, but it's become a must have for high performing revenue organizations or revenue organizations taking themselves seriously. And look, it's been peaks and troughs, right? So you do have moments where the big need for enablement is onboarding dozens, if not hundreds of new starters in those times of hyper growth. Now in this economy, we see the need for enablement really focused on rep productivity and contribution per head count. So most revenue organizations have at least some form of enablement. And I do tend to find that salespeople and sales managers, when considering what companies to join, are often now interrogating, what's the state of enablement or what enablement where I and my team can expect. It's just seen as a part of that sales toolkit and a necessary, I don't want to say employee benefit, but definitely an indication that a business is taking the development and productivity of its people seriously and equipping them with what they need. Now, the downside, because not everything is always perfect, is that, with this focus on enablement, I think we have seen a number of instances that sales leaders or execs tend to see enablement as that silver bullet. Oh, well, we have enablement, so it'll just be fine. But as I mentioned, my previous answer, it's not just on the shoulders of enablement. For instance, these sales reps don't report to us. So even if we're trying to get them to do something differently or do something better, ultimately, whether they do it or not, comes down to accountability and coaching, which really sits on the manager's shoulders. So, it'd be like you saying, hey, well, now my kid has a tutor, so I don't need to make sure they've done their homework or read to them at night. So I do think that it's not it's a partnership versus a fully outsourced function, but with the growth of enablement and the resources according to it, it has become a little bit of a push pull in terms of that joint accountability. But I have to say it's definitely been nice to be working in a space that is going through a phase of growth that's becoming more and more respected and especially more and more recognized.
Yeah, no, I totally agree, and you were totally right. Like sales enablement as a topic, as a in terms of the, I was gonna, in terms of the recruitment aspect, I was gonna say, like, but look, you're totally right. Look, over the 10 years, you're right. I probably wouldn't have even certainly the first 3 or 4 years. It just wasn't a thing. I
Yeah.
think. It certainly wasn't a thing within the kind of the startup and scale up world that I spent my time in. Maybe in the bigger organizations, it was probably starting to blossom and flourish a
Yeah.
bit.
I mean, look, the blue chips always had structured programs, content. It's probably more anchored on the training side, but now you'll see, series A, B companies starting to bring in sales enablement, in those earlier days. I've done some consulting work, for instance, with a company that has 11 sales reps. I mean, what a great ratio, right? Like, the right ratio for a high performing team is like 1 to sort of between 40 and 50, enablement to field folks. So the idea that they would invest in enablement with a handful of people, but they want to get that motion and the benchmark kind
Yeah.
of first time right, um, and really accelerate the ramp of anybody new coming in. If they go from 11 to 22, that's 2x growth, right? So it's as I said, it's becoming a known entity even before you're in a massive kind of blue chip organization.
Mm. And just in that, is that a founder, not asking for obviously any company names, but is that a founder that has worked for a bigger organization and seen sales enablement work really well? And he's trying to bring that into a startup environment, or is like, what's the sort of driving factor behind getting that right so early?
It's usually not the CEO. It's usually like a head of sales or a revenue leader.
Okay.
And yeah, it's usually people who have worked in bigger organizations, seen it done
Yeah.
well, understand the value, and want to
Yeah.
invest in that early. Because just in my opinion, the longer you wait, the more
Mm.
course correcting you have to do. It actually slows down the effectiveness of enablement because unlearning and unwinding this sort of heritage of bad habits or chaos or whatever the
Mm.
problem is you're in to solve, that takes time before you can then you have to unlearn to then relearn, becomes a lot longer than just learning in the first place. So it's either like a first time head of sales or like a new head of sales or revenue that would come in and say, right, we got to get this right, or we've got to set this up so that as we scale, this stuff can scale rather than get to a point of scale, realize nobody's doing anything the right way or the same way, and then red flag, oh my gosh, we need enablement help, which is probably great for you, Simon, because those are the calls you'll get. But at that
Yeah.
point, it's a different, setting it up, it becomes a different job to saying, all right, kind of wading through the mess. Sort of like if you were going to decorate a new house versus renovate an old house.
I like it. I like it. I like it. Yeah, I mean, you said about silver bullet. I think you're right. All this stuff takes time, and I think that's a great. I mean, good luck. Off air, I'd love to understand who that company is. They're obviously setting themselves up for success. That's super cool. Okay, and look, that leads us nicely into in terms of mistakes. Okay, so are there any sort of consistent or common mistakes that you've seen with companies when setting up this function?
Like so many. I think we need a whole different
Yeah, of
podcast
course.
about this. I think that a lot of the mistakes companies make when setting up the function is that they don't know exactly what they want to get out of it, besides some broad strokes like improve performance. Well, okay, yes, and who are you hiring? What's your product market fit? What competitive threats does someone have? What markets are you in? What's happening with the economy? How are your leaders, right? So how are you paying people? So if you just think about all of the different variables that go into performance, attainment, and success, being able to say, cool, we're investing in enablement, silver bullet, it's too broad. So great enablement, sort of like a great CRM or a great talent acquisition function or a great employee experience or great management, great office space or great remote working, right? Like think about, it's an important ingredient in the recipe for success, but it itself is not the only factor. So what's really important is that companies start to laser in and say, cool, if that is our business objective to kind of raise performance or improve attainment or whatever that is, what are the sort of functional successes? What are we actually looking for in terms of output and outcome from this function that is in line with all the other things we're doing to drive that success? So I've been in a number of situations where I'm brought in and they say, well, you tell us. And it's like, okay, well, I could tell you a lot of things, but it's probably more working backwards to what is it that you want out of this? Why did you invest in this? And what does success look like for you 12 months, 24 months from now? And then I can come back and tell you how we're going to get there, how we're going to be held accountable, what we can commit to, and what we need in order to succeed. So I think it's knowing, it's almost like a gut check of knowing we need it. But a lot of leaders, particularly who haven't brought this function in before, or who've come from larger businesses where this is just institutionalized, they don't really know. So I think for anybody out there might be listening, thinking of creating enablement for the first time, think about what you actually want out of it, because if it's the biggest issue is, we really just want to make sure there's clear and consistent content, that's one type of enablement function. If it's really more about training and onboarding, it's another. If it's about efficiency and effectiveness, now we're getting into process tools. So, your goals, like any client, is going to dictate the kind of enablement you need and the kind of people you need to do it. And I also then see enablers come in who are either too quick or too slow about it. Too quick meaning they just want to be a people pleaser and show their value, and they get into it, but they end up sort of investing in the wrong areas, or they're too quick out of the gate without really understanding the business. They're not really able to meet the business where it is because they just sort of want to show off and do shiny, cool stuff. And then sometimes they're too slow in that they don't focus as well on quick wins. So they're like, here's a 3-year transformation idea, which is great. But oftentimes these are revenue organizations gasping for air, needing to meet their month, their quarter, their year now. So trying to find that sweet spot is key. But I often find it helps to work backwards from the business objectives to then accelerate how enablement can move forward to meet them.
Oh, cool. Okay. And RevOps and sales enablement, I think in businesses of a certain scale, obviously work side by side and absolutely in harmony, ideally, most of the time. We had a previous episode with a lady who talks about this. If anybody's interested in that, Danielle, check that out. But what's your view on RevOps and how it dovetails into sales enablement in the companies that you've worked with?
So I'll say something very controversial. I think they're neighbors. I don't think they're the same family. In many organizations, enablement sits in a RevOps organization. I've been in that situation a number of times. I don't think there's anything contentious about it. I just think it's just two completely different jobs serving the same goal, which is field productivity. So I could see on paper, you're like, well, there's this side of productivity, which is, the systems, tools, operationalization, business rhythm sort of stuff. And then you've got training, content, coaching, etc. That is on the enablement side. So A plus B equals a productive sales force. But what you usually find is that there's sales ops people and there's enablement people, two completely different skill sets, two completely different backgrounds, very little crossover from like a day-to-day functional perspective. What they share, of course, is the same internal customers, right? A sales leader or a sales team or whatever segment you're working with. And often you're working on the same initiatives, right? So if we're trying to roll out a sales methodology, there's definitely a project management and systems and tools integration, right? Get those fields in Salesforce, or how are we going to track this, as well as the rollout, training, coaching, asset development that sits alongside it. But that would be no different than, say, enablement and product marketing working together to roll out a new sales pitch, right? Someone has to write it, product marketing, and then someone has to certify everyone on that, enablement. So I would say that any smart revenue business aligns all of their cross-functional teams to the same set of priorities, right? Those might show up as different sorts of initiatives, but I often find that sometimes there's shared responsibilities like forecasting excellence, and there's sometimes super unique things, sort of RevOps being more like, quote to cash, and enablement focusing on things like sales coaching. So you would usually never see people coming across from ops to enablement or enablement to ops, unless it's, for instance, enabling around or focusing on, say, CRM or things that are very heavily analytical. So I just think because enablement, as I said, is a young profession, and there has been kind of no historic kind of natural home for something that kind of sprang up organically. You sometimes do see an enablement team or sometimes a rogue enablement person sitting in a RevOps or sales ops organization. And usually a head of sales ops is an ops person. And they're looking at the enablement person being like, well, I can't do your job. I don't know what you have to do here. So it does often sometimes make it difficult for enablement folks to get a seat at the leadership table, because the ops leader sometimes doesn't know what they don't know about enablement. So what questions they ask, the clarity they get, they're not always able to represent that. And secondly, it hinders sometimes the development opportunities for the enablement person, because they're usually a small person or small team in a much bigger ocean of operations people. I'm definitely generalizing, but I would just say that enablement could sit within a product marketing team just as easily as they could sit in an operations team. So I think enablement should sit alongside RevOps, all reporting into a revenue leader, because together, alongside all the other cross functionals like pre-sales, like post-sales, like marketing, like everything, we all serve to improve the revenue and performance of an organization. So there's no need to kind of bury us in some place, even if we're working on shared goals.
Okay, cool. And in terms of your experience, how is the tech stack, and what's like sort of, what's the what are the sort of the essential tech stack within enablement?
So one of the things I've found over the last number of years, whether it's enablement, sales, or any other practitioner, is an explosion of tech, right? Everybody's got a tool that does everything now. Everyone went kind of crazy over the last 10 years, and then over COVID, certainly, just buying a bunch of tech. I think we are in a tech debt right now. Companies have just overinvested in all these systems and tools. It's very interesting to then see how much they're actually used and leveraged. And maybe it's just because I'm old school, or maybe it's just because if I do buy something, I like to see value for money. I think less is more when it comes to tech, because otherwise you actually have to overinvest resource in just managing all these tools versus actually doing your actual job. So unless the tool is going to make your job significantly better or significantly easier, the total cost of ownership is not just the cost of the software, but the human capital cost to implement, develop, maintain, etc. And for anyone listening out there, enablement teams historically and currently usually are not departments that has a ton of resource available. We're often very lean, having to be very scrappy, and usually a little bit light on the head count. So I'm an advocate of focusing on must have versus just nice to have. But again, someone else might just be a tech junkie and love all this stuff.
Yeah.
So as an enablement team, I think there's literally 4 things I can't live without. Everything else I'm willing to be convinced, but again, every time you buy something, you need to maintain it, and that is a lot of bandwidth. So first, you definitely need some sort of learning management system, particularly in this modern era, virtual, hybrid, etc. You need a way to deploy e-learning, self-paced learning, micro-learning, and a way to track who completes what, right? So whether it's super sophisticated, whether it's really bare bones, some sort of platform where you can deploy training and learning that's trackable, you've got to have. Track things like certifications, right? So some sort of content management system. Now, some are super sophisticated where you can really track what content is being used at what stage, with what customer, etc. That's brilliant. Sometimes that's more for marketing than enablement, but that's a gray area. For me, like that's awesome. At an absolute minimum, you need some way to ensure that the revenue teams have the right assets they require to do their jobs. So it's not just some sort of black hole. You're not just slacking a bunch of people. You don't need to spend hours and hours looking for the right stuff. Here's your pitch deck. Here's the pricing info. Here's the battle cards, right? Here's the competitive info. So it's just about ensuring that there's some easy way for you to manage that content for them and for them to get what they need with ease when they need it. I think one more recent tech development that I think is a must have is conversational intelligence. One of the most powerful way to learn is hearing your peers, seeing real life examples, especially now that we're not all in the same office anymore. And with so many customer interactions being virtual, being able to shadow and hear and scale those best practices is gold. And conversational intelligence really captures it. It really helps us understand why those things were good and also identify calls, right? So if you're focusing on a competitive enablement or competitive selling, you can easily identify, well, when was X competitor raised in a call, or how many customers are talking about blah, or if you're trying to say, hey, here's a discovery call, but then that rep talked 90% of the time. It's just, it creates so much insight and makes it so much easier for managers to coach and for reps to learn and for enablement to really be that catalyst to share and scale. So the final one is, again, depending on your sophistication, some sort of instructional design tool. I love Articulate. Some people go much more sophisticated, but the age of read some boring slide deck or listen to me talk into a video screen, it's just not how people learn anymore. And I think, enablement, trying to keep up with at least things like, the trust and safety training, right? Or the sexual harassment training that you get. Like, sometimes talking about new fields in Salesforce is dry enough. So you might as well just be really thoughtful about what's going to be the right, easiest to consume and most engaging modality, which is sometimes a workshop or a talking head, but sometimes you do need to get a little creative. So a tool that helps you ease that along, especially if you don't have deep instructional design resources or background, really helps. So LMS, CMS, CI, and ID, those would be my 4 acronyms to go with anytime. The rest to me are either a nice to have or sometimes a bit of a ballast.
Cool. Okay. AI and machine learning. Obviously it's a big hype topic at the moment, and it's disrupting and has its place in certain businesses under different use cases. How do you see it sort of enhancing the work that you're doing within sales enablement?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's more, look, I don't think so far for me it's been either a radical improvement or necessarily a hindrance.
Okay.
Per se. So look, I've started to see it really come to life, helping my small team, which I've always had, a small team kind of work more productively. So if you're stuck with some activity ideas, or you can have Chat GPT help you structure a session, or I was using it the other day to help synthesize some really heavy technical product related information I got from marketing into pithier language. So I think anything that AI or machine learning can do to help enablement departments work more efficiently is brilliant. We've also seen examples where, if done correctly, especially with the right backend sort of tagging and alignment, that some of the productivity gains with surfacing, say, the right content and the right learning to different audiences at the right time is very cool. The only constraint there is someone has to identify what's correct on the back end, because so far AI won't know if that battle card is meant for what exactly, even if it has certain words in it. So because sales is not super linear, right? Like you might need that competitive info at a first call and a last call. So where in the sales process does that battle card belong, right? That's where it kind of gets tricky. But again, any of that shortcutting for reps to find and get what they need certainly within things like conversational intelligence, being able to super quickly analyze calls, highlight certain things, it really cuts down on searching and identifying the right things, which is great. Where I've seen a lot of promises, but I'm skeptical, but again, I'm a tech skeptic, so take it with a grain of salt, is a lot of platforms promising to be able to give feedback on, say, a like a simulated pitch certification, for instance, right? Or like doing a demo, being able to offer that coaching, right? So taking the load off of managers or off of enablement to observe reps and offer that feedback. AI can give that to them. I sort of think, yes, if it's something that's technical and box ticking and did they say this, did you show that? Sure. But ultimately, the point of any kind of certification or assessment is not just to tick a box, right? It's to actually have a moment as a leader to step back and say, how is this person? Are they any good? Do I have some concerns? What am I seeing here? So it is an important moment for managers and leaders to observe. And it's an important opportunity for that rep to get feedback that's meaningful, not just about what they did in that recording or that, role play or whatever, because those are always a little artificial and awkward. But, it's a real investment in their development. So if you're going to outsource anything, it would probably be cool to be able to use AI to like update the CRM with call notes from a customer meeting rather than type it out. Or I don't know if we could automate forecasting or other heavy scheduling or other administrative tasks. But I do think that trying to machinify development and coaching and those moments of observation is robbing those people and all of us of that important human experience. So like all things tech, it's always going to be that battle between meaning versus efficiency. So choosing it wisely is very important. But yeah, you can chat GPT and do research on prospects super quickly. As long as you can personalize your outreaches, rock and roll.
Yeah, cool. Yeah. Okay. Look, in terms of enablement or within a hybrid or remote setting, how have you managed to sort of enable effectively in the world that we are today?
I'm going to say this, it's terrible. It's terrible for us. It's terrible for them.
Yeah.
It's just been not great. Now, not great for a few reasons. I mean, everything obviously is as the world scaled and technology existed, right? Like we were always doing things virtually. It's funny, people had a big focus during COVID on how do we start to sell not face to face? And you thought, well, you're not always selling face to face, are you? Unless you're like a door to door salesperson, you were always having video conferences or phone calls at different points of the process. Obviously, during COVID times, we were all forced to do 100% virtual all the time, but we've always been hybrid sellers and workers, you know? I'm trying to think of the last time that every single person I ever dealt with was face to face. So a bummer about this sort of virtual hybrid environment is genuinely, it's less about the enablement, but it's more that opportunity for on the spot learning and coaching. So there was a real difference. Like when I was in sales, I sat at a desk, I had a phone, I had other people next to me. I was on the phone, they were on the phone. My manager could hear us, we could hear each other. And then just sometimes you pick up an amazing gem. Like you could just hear someone overcoming an objection. You're like, that is brilliant. Or you could turn to your manager in 1 second and say, hey, real fast, I have a question. Or you could get a little feedback from your manager, be like, hey, next time, say blah, 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 without, again, having to send the Zoom, listen to the Zoom, connect on the Zoom, talk it through. And it all becomes a bit more labored. So those moments of inspiration, it's where it's tough. So learning has become a lot more formal. Training has become a lot more structured. And Zoom fatigue is real. Honestly, even if you have the best training program in the world, putting people on a Zoom for 3 hours makes them lose the will to live. But you can't always do a 45-minute session and that has the same impact. It was very different if you say, hey, let's just get off the floor for a morning, get in a conference room, and do some objection handling role plays until we smoke it. You had to take breaks, but you had energy, you had connection. Then sometimes everyone would go out for a beer, right? Like, so the learning created camaraderie. The camaraderie made people more interested to learn. So despite whether it's COVID or whether it's cost consciousness, yes, technically, could I speak to you through Zoom, get through the same 10 slides? And yes, technically, we've, ticked the box, we've done it. Absolutely. Will that have the same impact? No. Does it suck for us when we're standing or sitting, speaking into what feels like the abyss with cameras off? Like, we know people are cruising Instagram or making lunch or multitasking or putting themselves on the Zoom and leaving the room. You can always tell when you do breakout rooms and then people don't go in. Like, it's, so it's not about our experience. It's just part and parcel of the learner experience. So, for any leaders who might be listening to this who say, hey, where do we want to put our chips? Like, it does diminish it, and I'm not going to pretend it doesn't. So in order to succeed in spite of some of these constraints, which are real, certainly at the moment in a number of ways, we do need to think more creatively about, smaller bites to get to the same meal. So what that might mean is you can't kind of do these like mega enablement days. You might have to deliver a program for an hour a day over a couple of weeks, right? It's just the reality of it. You've got to think about micro learning. You've got to think about self-paced more, which again has advantages and disadvantages, right? So, but the upside is that sometimes with the tech and with the virtual, you can do things you couldn't do otherwise, right? Like it would be very difficult to try to do breakout rooms physically with 100 people in like a conference space. There's no physical rooms. But you could do a really cool thing with 1 billion Zoom breakout rooms, no problemo, right? You could do like massive quizzes. You can get people, get a star rep in front of an audience at scale. Like, they're getting to profile themselves and interact with people they would have never been able to do otherwise. You can also bring enablement more quickly because, look, I no longer have to travel to 6 markets to deliver one program, which might take me 2 months. I could do that all in a week. Zoom, 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 zoom. So I still think it's more glass half empty than glass half full, but we've got to meet the businesses where they are. I do think that it's hard to put a number on like how much more effective is it in person. It's just, Simon, if we were not in a virtual environment right now, but sitting in a studio together, like this conversation would feel different to both of us and perhaps to our listeners as well. So back to the earlier point about technology, there is a human component to all of this that we shouldn't overlook. And I think while learning takes a lot of different styles, sellers or people who work in revenue organizations do tend to be more sociable creatures.
Yeah, totally agree. Totally agree. And within some of the large organizations, like how are things localized into each of the specific markets? I mean, that must be a huge challenge, and how do you effectively drive these programs and initiatives?
So I think that there's probably more stress than is warranted about localization. And I say that as someone from New York who's also a British citizen who's lived in Asia. There's more common challenges than different requirements. If you can show me one sales leader anywhere who feels that their team is just doing an amazing job at discovery, I'll, fall off my chair right now. So you see what I mean? When is price not a pressure? When is competitive not an issue? Now, you might have different competitors in different markets or different levels of price sensitivity, but the principles remain the same. So I think that where it all comes down to is identifying common versus different challenges. So just as an example, when I was living in APAC, our teams in Australia really, really struggled with kind of getting to sea level. right? They were doing really well at LinkedIn. They had, obviously market leading, but really wanted to get beyond just kind of the talent acquisition space into that kind of chief human resource officer kind of arena. And that was like their biggest pressure. Go to India, however, and their price negotiations were off the hook. The rep would give the price, which was pretty firm and dictated. At that point, we're part of Microsoft, we're a listed business, we were a listed business anyway. Like, it's pretty structured. And then the client would say, I'll pay you $1, and it was, however much value selling you were doing was insane. And some of the products, in fairness, were not priced for the Indian market. You could literally hire 50 people for the price of one piece of software, and it's just the market dynamics. So I think what's important is recognizing where there are truly differences versus when people are saying, oh, it's, our market is different, our market is special. Well, it's like kind of like saying my kid is different, my kid is special. Yes, and they all eat lunch, right? They all have to go to bed, they all have to brush their teeth. So it's so if you kind of zoom out of the intrinsic differences, which would inform what programs you do in the first place, right? If one market is really struggling with multi-threading and another market is desperately needing negotiation, you wouldn't maybe run multi-threading programs across the world in that case. But if you are running global programs, often there's two easy ways to win the room. The first is think about language. It's pretty obvious. Obviously, every piece of content can't be translated to French, Japanese, whatever, right? Like, where some businesses have that luxury, and that's amazing. Some do not, and that's okay. So if you cannot translate, or if you're running a training and you do not have a local trainer, for instance, to facilitate in local language, there's a couple of tips I would have. So the first is, look, if that audience speaks English, it is absolutely okay to train in English or whatever that language is. But if you're doing activities or role plays, allow them to do that in their local language. Really, just because they will get more out of it. Now, obviously, the constraint is that if you don't speak that language, can't observe and monitor, right? So I once did this in Japan, and I literally had no idea if they were talking about the product or talking about the weather. But the way to solve for that is you tee up some local managers or some high performers to kind of be those local coaches to help keep things on track. Or if someone's sharing a personal experience or a war story, allow them to do that in that local language. Or if you're confident in a manager's ability to run a workshop, for instance, do a train the trainer so they get to run the entire thing in French or German or Japanese or whatever. So that opportunity to, not force people to model or practice or discuss in language that they're not comfortable with, I promise you, they're going to spend more time trying to figure out how to say this in English than they might getting better at whatever you're hoping they will do. Plus, when they're out in the field, they're not going to do that pitch in English anyway. So you need to be thoughtful about that. And I will say that they appreciate that. So they get the fact that, for instance, I only speak English, no points against, but if I let them role play in French, they're like, you know what, we appreciate that sensitivity, especially if you're part of a multinational. Usually the business language is English. Another thing is a little bit of the optics. This is going to sound funny, but sometimes, like if you have a case study, right? Change the location, change the name, and change the specifics. So we had our typical onboarding scenario, Acme Co. from New York City. You know what? Change that to, I don't know, Windsor Co. from London, UK, or, Pisa Co. from, Florence, Italy, or, you're talking to Jack, or you're talking to Muhammad, or you're talking to, Yo-Yo, like these small things you can do with the same premise just to try to show a little bit of local sensitivity can also really help resonate and overcome that perception that, oh, this is some American or British or whatever thing that's not going to work in my market. So I do think that, look, a big mistake enablement people and revenue leaders tend to have is really mandating that everything has to be identical. I think what needs to be identical is that the objectives get hit. If some team in some place, some segment or region wants to change it or localize it or chop and change it, I would just recommend, like, don't die on the hill of it has to be this. Die on the hill of, is the integrity of the thing maintained? So as long as you hit the mark, they want to hit the mark a different way, let them, because they're going to do it either way. So you might as well, you're either going to know they're doing it or they're just going to do it. So focus on the outcome. Don't be overly obsessed with how you get there. And if there's any way for you to demonstrate that cultural flexibility to help them get on that journey, they're going to buy into and participate in and be willing partners with you along the way.
This person-to-person connection you've mentioned, a few times across the conversations in different ways. Yeah, totally understand. There's lots of debate about which metrics are important to track and how ROI can be tracked and attributed to sales enablement. You talked a little bit about no silver bullet and this stuff obviously taking time. Through the different episodes, there's been like leading and lagging indicators and different viewpoints on this. But what's your viewpoint on what's important?
Yeah, well, measuring the impact of enablement is super important. As we said, there's usually, it sits alongside a variety of factors that go into what's ultimately the North Star metric, which is either, accelerating revenue or improving productivity or operational efficiency, right? So top line or bottom line or a combination of the two. So it's really important to be able to kind of distill and hone in on that connection between enablement and outcome. So there's usually 3 tiers of metrics, going from sooner to later, or like easier to harder to attribute, right? So the baseline level is learning. Who was trained, how they were trained, did they pass, right? A lot of enablers focus on reaction data. I love the workshop, I hate the workshop, would you recommend this workshop to a friend? That's really helpful in terms of sentiment and getting feedback, but it's not like customer NPS, where customer satisfaction data usually leads to a repeat purchase. If you're some AE, it's not like, oh, well, I'd love to take another one of these. It's, well, you're going to anyway, right? And ultimately, sales leaders really care about the impact of these sessions, not just the feelings about them. Even though people loving it and people being keen for more it helps. So learning data is just your baseline. It's facts. Who did it? To what degree? How many? Then there's the leading indicators, which are they starting to do something better? So let's say you've just done a session on prospecting. You can start to look at our outbound efforts increasing, right? Our responses increasing. So then you look at the lagging indicators, which is ultimately the revenue generated, or stage 3 opportunities, or whatever the manifestation of that initiative would be. So what's really important for all of these are 2 things. The first is that it's rooted in performance goals. So when an enablement need is surfaced, the first question is, okay, well, what's the business goal, right? What do we need to achieve? And then what's the performance goal? What do people need to start doing differently in order to do it? Because if nobody had to do anything differently, you wouldn't be enabling on anything. You would just be running out the clock, right? Just keep doing that. Okay. There's no intervention required. So to enable suggests a change is needed. So what is that change? And how are we going to know that change has been happening? And then how do we hypothesize what the impact of that change will be? So actually, the metrics you would uncover in that scoping or discovery before you even commit to enabling dictates the same metrics you would look at afterwards. So all you want to see is the before versus after of that enablement intervention. Has the enablement helped to make a difference? If not, why not? Is it the enablement or is it something else? The data just tells us what. Obviously, the conversation tells us why, but you should never go into a program or start even building an enablement intervention without having predefined what is it that those leaders are looking at in the first place that are telling them there's some sort of problem. Usually, hey, our pipe numbers are low, or our call numbers are low, or our conversion sucks. So you will use those same metrics, including the learning data, to then determine the success of the program. The challenging thing is that because, in that example, it was about prospecting and pipeline building, how you would measure that might be very, very different to how you would measure, say, negotiation, right? Or C-level conversations. You would be looking at entirely different data points. Those leading indicators, often lagging indicators, would be very varied. So the difficulty is in almost like summarizing up one data point beyond just revenue acceleration or say contribution per rep. You could look at ramp time, right, as an example of overall metrics. But in a way, the metrics that matter will depend on the problem you're trying to solve. And it creates a slightly more complex story, which makes our lives more difficult, but it is the truth of the measurement itself. And it's a lot of more education, I think, is needed to businesses about what is fair attribution and indeed the right way to measure enablement.
Okay, cool. So look, for anybody that's interested, listens to this and is like really interested to get into the space, right? Or somebody that's new into the space now, is there any advice that you would give those people? And also second part to that is, are there any sort of communities, learning resources that you think you can point them to kind of help them accelerate their own learning?
Yeah, sure. I mean, if anybody new to the space, appreciate the fact that there's no one playbook. And I would say that in terms of the antecedents to success, the best enablers tend to be really good all rounders. So almost like an equal skill set in stakeholder management, project management, and content development and delivery. Obviously, if you're a people leader, naturally people management, but it's like any job that requires multiple skill sets. There's always going to be one or two of those things that are your natural sweet spot, and then another one or two that are, a harder muscle. So don't just lean into the comfort zone, because if you are great at producing and delivering content, but you're crap at stakeholder management, unless you're in a role that's just about creating and delivering content, like you're going to need to be good at that side of the job. So, I think that a lot of people who move over into enablement with a transferable skill, say from sales or from marketing or from ops even, there's a genuine difference between presenting, even with confidence, versus facilitating, right? It's kind of the difference between mentoring and coaching. So you teaching them and being that expert is kind of usually how we kind of start these things. But actually, our job as enablers is not necessarily always to be that person. Sometimes we create the vehicle for either other people to shine, like top rep or a manager, right? Because even if you come from the business like I did, you will get to a point where people are selling things you never sold, or you're having to train people who were much more successful than you, or I was an enterprise rep, but then I had to go and, train up our global accounts team. I had never worked on deals that big. So the idea of the imposter syndrome of either I've never carried a bag, or I've never carried your bag or this bag, you got to put that behind you, because your job is not to be always the expert. Your job is to create those right interventions and experiences for people to gain that expertise. And that expertise can either come from other experts, or which sometimes is you, or, and most powerfully, it could come from the field developing their own expertise through practice and application and coaching. So the way I like to think about it, if you're new to enablement, is, you know what? You're not the lion tamer. You're not the trapeze artist. You're not the clown in the car. You're the circus master.
It's a great,
And
great analogy. I love it.
and then yeah, there's three kind of like leading societies, communities that I can recommend. You know, there's the Revenue Enablement Society, which has national and international chapters. Also, the Enablement Collective that has a lot of training and conferences. And then the Enablement Squad, which is more of a community. There's a Slack channel, which is great for kind of peer-to-peer learning, especially if you're a solo enabler or new to it or have a small team. It's really helpful to be able to pick other people's brains. And I tend to find the enablement community overall is very generous with sharing and scaling those best practices. Since if one of us wins, all of us win.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Andrea, that's amazing insight into some of those answers. I mean, I'm sure there's much longer and that's a whole topic in itself, some of those. So thank you for sharing all of that great insight. Just to kind of finish off the session, I've just got a little bit of fun, right? It's just quick fire questions.
You saying this wasn't fun? No.
Well, more fun.
There it is.
We're going to finish off with more fun.
I'm into it.
So it's the quick fire questions, not too much thought about it, please. So without further ado, we'll drum roll, please. Right. Favorite piece of tech or app you are using now?
Oh God. After everything we just said, I think the New York Times crossword puzzle app every day.
Okay, cool. Night at the disco or night at the restaurant?
Restaurant.
Okay, cool. Favorite food?
Individual food or cuisine?
Oh, good question. Let's go with cuisine.
Chinese.
Okay. Favorite movie?
Terrible question. I'm just Back to the Future.
Okay. I'm sure this could be a few, but favorite place that you visited on holiday or just generally visited in your life?
I'm only thinking because I have been to a lot of wonderful places. It's got to be Paris every time.
Paris, okay. iOS or Android?
iOS.
Okay. And if you had one superpower, what would it be and why?
I would live forever because there's a lot of stuff I want to do.
Okay, cool. Okay, that brings us to a close. Okay, Andrea, thanks so much. Sorry we've overrun by a few minutes. That's awesome. If anybody wants to get in touch with you just about anything that we've spoken about, Content Square, or just to get to know you, what's the best way to do that?
LinkedIn, probably the best. Very happy to connect, although do personalize your connection, send a little note. And yeah, always happy to share thoughts and discuss enablement or sales or go-to-market strategy or nerd out to theater with people. So LinkedIn is probably the best place to find me.
Perfect. Okay, thank you very much. Have a lovely rest of your Friday, and thanks for joining us today.
A delight. Thanks for having me on.
Okay, thanks very much, Andrea. It was awesome. Sorry we overran by a bit. And